Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we've got a This Year in Perfume, and it's going to be a ranked This Year in Perfume, and it's going to be on the year 1990. So on one side of the coin, there is some sadness in my heart because we are leaving my favorite decade of all time. Although I'm very proud of those ranked This Year in Perfume videos, especially in the 80s. They're a great way to sort of explore scents from a certain time period. And exploring scents from a certain time period has served me very well, especially once you really learn your taste. Whenever you expand your horizons and you smell a bunch of different types of fragrances and different eras and different perfumers and all of this stuff, and you really settle on a fragrance style that you love, it's a great way to dive into different fragrances from one year to the next. Usually houses tend to copy each other. The fragrance game is a copycat game sometimes. And so it's just a matter of finding stuff that really fits your taste and your era and diving into that era. And for me, it really is the 1980s. That is the decade. That's by far my favorite decade in perfume. However, as the year 1990 will show, there are many fantastic fragrances that we're still going to be discussing. Even though it may not have the breadth and the depth of the 80s, there's actually only 9 fragrances from the year 1990 in this video. So the days of having 15, 20, 25 fragrances from one year in my collection, I think, are pretty much done. But as usual, I want to start off with a couple things. Let's do, real quick, let's just do scent of the day, because today I wore a scent that absolutely just knocks my socks off, and I have been in love with Vetiver lately. Vetiver's been one of those notes where, it started out, when I really started my fragrance journey, I was one of those people that was like, I don't think I like Vetiver. Persolaise describes it as, sometimes it can go like swampy. I've heard him describe it as that. And I don't think it was that. I just think Vetiver's a note that you need some time to warm up to. It's not the note you're going to spray for somebody, and someone who's newer to fragrance as a hobby or an addiction is going to smell it and go, oh, I absolutely love this. It's not going to happen. It's something that really needs time and time spent and understanding of fragrance ingredients, because really, you've heard me say things like labdanum is such a complex note that it can stand as a perfume on its own. Oud is such a complex note it can stand as a perfume on its own. But the other note that should be thrown in with those, in my opinion, is vetiver. Because vetiver is such a complex note depending on where it's grown. There's a lot of vetiver that comes from Haiti, and so you'll find Haitian vetiver, but you'll also find like Java vetiver. This particular vetiver I wear today has a bourbon vetiver note, and this is Etro's vetiver. Now, this is the vintage eau de cologne. These Etros are extremely underrated, and Etro actually sells clothes. So I lumped them in with my designer scents. I did a top 100 designer countdown for a celebration of one of my milestones. I forget which one, but it's under the, I have a top 5, top 10, top 100 playlist that you can go watch some of those older videos if you're newer to the channel. And I lumped Etro in with the designers because they do sell clothes. Same reasoning, Tom Ford is a designer to me. And the niche houses focus exclusively on perfume is the way I look at it. And so Etro is lumped in with the designers, but all of their scents have this extreme niche quality, very high quality ingredients. They smell very creative, and I think this is one of the most underrated houses for perfume lovers, and this has absolutely blown me away. Obviously, I think the bar set by Guerlain Vetiver, for me and my experience and history, knowledge of, fragrance history, will never be surpassed. I don't think another fragrance can ever top Guerlain's Vetiver as far as the icon and the status of what that is, and just one of the best masculine fragrances ever created. And I just think that will always stand in my mind as the reference Vetiver. But this is something that I have really fallen in love with since I got it a couple months back from Moudessir. This is basically a vetiver that feels like it's going in so many different directions, but many of those directions lean to the earthy, heavy, smoky fragrance side of things. So the way I described it to Rich Mitch today, we were talking to each other, and I said that this is a sweaty vetiver. Not swampy like Persolaise calls vetiver. I think this is a sweaty vetiver is how it feels to me. Which some people may be sitting there going, why would you want to smell like that? But once you get into vetiver, especially if you smelled like the actual Rochas and how complex and deep and rich it is, this. Oh, and you know, there's notes like clary sage, which can also be slightly sweaty, petitgrain, sagebrush, bergamot, gaiac wood. There's iris in here, and there's amber, and Parfumo says tobacco flower. Fragrantica says tobacco, but there's definitely this tobacco-like vibe in the base, which I absolutely love, and it goes really great with that earthy quality of the vetiver in here. The vetiver just feels like it's like growing down the side of a volcano. It has that smoky, earthy quality to it. It's deep, it's rich. You can see this is not a thin colored juice. There's this richness to this juice, at least in the vintage Eau de Cologne version. So Etro's vetiver has been, I mean, almost a revelation in the vetiver game. I need to rank my vetiver scents, but I'm thinking this is probably, just off the top of my head, a top 5 vetiver scent for me. It is unbelievable. Oh, it's so, and it has this woody sort of undertone. And Fragrantica also lists a note that is not listed in Parfumo, and that's cypress. They say that there's cypress in here. I don't know which one's right, whether Fragrantica's right and it's cypress, whether, you know, Parfumo's right and there's no cypress, but whatever it is, just a fantastic vetiver scent. There is a green aspect to it, but I don't know if that comes from sort of the Artemisia sagebrush in the top, or whether there is a little bit of that medicinal cypress in the mid. But what a composition this is. For vetiver lovers, don't sleep on Etro's vetiver. Now, one thing to mention, I've only smelled this version, the vintage Eau de Cologne. I've never smelled the modern Eau de Toilette, but I hear Etro takes fantastic care of their fragrances, so I wouldn't be afraid of buying the modern. But if you want the one I'm talking about, it's the vintage Eau de Cologne. Okay, so that's scent of the day. So let's talk a little bit about 1990 and some famous historical events from the year. 1990, I was about 5 years old, so you start to, you know, have some memories that begin to creep in. I definitely remember playing Super Mario Brothers in the early 90s because we were still living in an apartment at the time, and I remember one of our neighbors up above his father used to just sit around all day, drink beer, play Mario Brothers. Who knows what he did for a living, but I remember going over to this kid's house, early 90s, and just playing Mario Brothers around 1990. And just, you know, your memories start to form when you're a little kid. And so I kind of remember a little bit about 1990 finally. The late 80s is sort of a blur for me, but this is the year where things start to come together. But a couple famous world events. So apparently North and South Yemen unite to become one country in 1990. So they decided to merge. Doesn't happen every day. There was a big earthquake in Iran, 7.4 magnitude earthquake that they estimated the death toll was between 35 and 50,000 people dead. That's a big earthquake. Switzerland and the World Wide Web, Tim Berners publishes, sorry, let's try his name again, if I could butcher it anymore. Tim Berners-Lee publishes his formal proposal for the World Wide Web. Very interesting. That was in 1990. We take that for granted, obviously. But obviously the military was using some sort of function of that for decades before we got it in the 90s. But it is interesting to see a formal proposal being outlined, documenting this access to the internet using hypertext in web pages and browsers. Spooky language. And so the United States launched the Hubble telescope, I believe. I think that was in 1990. It says that the most complete skeleton of a T-Rex ever is found. Most well-preserved, 90% complete. Very cool stuff. And the demolition of the Berlin Wall began. I know I talked a little bit about that in our previous This Year in Perfume episodes. Saddam Hussein invades his neighboring country of Kuwait, which basically prompted the reaction from us and the allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, and they sent troops to Kuwait to begin Operation Desert Shield. And what else has happened? Oh, The Simpsons The very first episode of The Simpsons is launched in 1990. So it's 33 years old. That is unbelievable that they've been on for that long. And the quality of content that they put out. I love The Simpsons. So yes, a lot of cool little things going on in the 1990s. But let's go to perfume. So this is only going to be a top 9, like I said. And actually, what I did is I pulled out a book because there's a handful of Italian perfumes that made the cut from my collection from 1990. And so I actually bought this book called The Handbook of Great Italian Perfumery about months ago, and I just kind of threw it, never even opened it up and read it. I mean, I read a couple, but I never read the whole thing through. But I was able to actually find, I think, 3 or 4 of the bottles on this list. So we're going to do some reading as well. I'll see how you guys like that. A little bit of reading from the Handbook of Great Italian Perfumery. So we'll get some first-hand knowledge, first-hand excerpts, if you will. So let's get started with number 9. So number 9 on the list is a fragrance that is often overlooked, I would say. And it's overlooked for one reason. I think the general public basically considers this fragrance to be cheap. Okay, that's their view of the fragrance, is that they consider it to be cheap. And it is now actually discontinued. In my experience with some of these older, let's call them drugstore fragrances, because that's kind of what they were. That's the reason that the public has this image of cheapness, because you would go into a Walgreens or just a local drugstore and see this selling for $5 or something. And it is Coty's preferred stock. Now, interestingly enough, a little bit of background about preferred stock is preferred stock actually initially was launched by Coty as a men's fragrance in 1955, but it is almost impossible to find any bottles of the original preferred stock floating around. I think it was like a yellowish looking bottle. I think there might be one on eBay, but they want like, you know, your left kidney and firstborn. And I've never smelled that, but I can tell you that this formulation, one thing that I found, and one of the reasons why I instantly sort of gravitated to vintage scents is you can buy bottles of this still, these vintage older bottles of preferred stock, for very cheap still. And one thing that you'll notice to me, and many of these, you know, cheap drugstore scents, they don't smell cheap, at least to my nose, at least not to the stuff that the houses are giving us nowadays. This actually smells really good. It's a scent that's focused around vetiver and sandalwood, and there is some floral notes in here. There's some green notes in here. And what you'll really pick up, though, is there's a touch of aldehydes in the top, a touch of spices. And so it makes the fragrance feel very modern, and yet there's a vintage tilt to the fragrance. That's why I really like preferred stock. And in the 90s, the early 90s, 1990, the blue wave of aquatic fragrances that come through haven't washed everything away yet. That's coming very soon, especially once we get to the mid-90s and Aqua de Jo and stuff like that. But for now, you're going to see in some of these houses that some of them still have a very 80s view of the world. They're not looking forward to the future. Some of them are, but many of them are still sort of looking into the 80s, which is great for me because there's actually a little hint of IBQ in here. Of this leathery isobutylquinoline note. And, but it's sort of a IBQ note that is beginning to look to the 90s, if that makes sense. So still has one foot in the 80s with the sandalwood and vetiver combination in the base. And I think there's a little bit of maybe patchouli or something to add some heft. But what a creation. I mean, for a drugstore fragrance, this is great. I'll do a full review on this one day. I'll do a review that about 10 people will watch because nobody likes to watch these big-time, old-school, discontinued, cheapy fragrances that you can still find lying around. Once stock dries up and then the bottles start going for $100 or $200, everyone will be flocking to it. But while it's still available, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, definitely don't sleep on preferred stock at number 9. Number 8. Number 8 on the list is a fragrance that I would love to hunt a vintage down. So this fragrance basically came out, obviously in 1990. And it was then reformulated, though, is the issue with it. So it was released in 1990, and it was distributed by Unilever, and then they basically discontinued it. Unilever discontinued it, and Coty picked up the distribution contract, and I think Coty is actually still distributing it. Yeah, my bottle is distributed by Coty Prestige, and this is Charooty 1881. So Cerruti 1881 has donned 1,000 flankers, and it's actually the first one in the book that we are going to talk about. So it's the first one that I actually have a little blurb to read you. So I'm gonna read you this little blurb. It says that it is classified as an aromatic fougere, and it was launched to celebrate the year in which Nino Cerruti's family's textile business was founded. How's that for random fun fact of the day? The chapter in an entrepreneurial success story destined to last over a century. This splendid celebration took the form of an elegant, generous fragrance composition, stylish, yet laid back and casual. Like many Italian fragrances, 1881 is a difficult one to pin down. It has a clean, refreshing barbershop vibe, a typical fougere aromatic vibe, a gentle floral vibe, and a vaguely chypre vibe. So this is, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I want you to, I don't want you to not buy the book if you're interested. I don't want to take sales away from this fine author who I don't even know. Is it Marika? I think it's Marika Vecchianati. Okay, so at least she is a traditional Italian writing on Italian perfumery. And so this has what she calls as a vaguely chypre vibe. And the reason that my spider senses start to go off when it comes to Cerruti 1881 is this is one of those fragrances that I hear fantastic things about. And when I smell this version, it's still quite good. But there's a handful of fragrances in my collection where I think, you know what? I bet you if I had the vintage version that I would completely understand why people go so crazy for this, or why people like it so much. And if you go to Parfumo, there's actually a little blurb written up by Keith, by Manly Scents, who has supplied me with some very rare, hard-to-find vintages all the way from Malta. And he writes that the modern version has a little bit more of a citrusy, zesty opening, and I definitely get that from this. This has a heavy, citrusy, fresh, great for summer vibe. And he says that the vintage version, the, say, 1990 to 2004 version, where Unilever was creating it, is actually more suited for spring and autumn rather than summer, because it's woodier, is what he says. So I'd love to smell that woodier version. But this is actually a really good, I think this is a good summer scent, even in its current form. I think it's still available. I don't think it's discontinued or anything like that. But what makes me even more interested to try the vintage version is the perfumer is Raymond Chaillan. And Raymond Chaillan has done some amazing fragrances in this style. So if you go back to fragrances like, for example, if you go back to something like, oh, can I grab it without spilling it everywhere? Let's see. So if you go back to something like YSL Pour Homme, that's Raymond Chaillan. If you go to something like Homme, Balenciaga's Homme, this is Raymond Chaillan. And you know what? This fragrance, you could sort of see more of a modern interpretation of something like this, or something like YSL Pour Homme, but reimagined for the early 90s. And this is starting to go to that fresher style. It still has some depth to it. That's why I like this fragrance, because there's still some balsam fir and patchouli, and there's even cumin and basil on the top. Kind of how, you know, I know I talked in the past how Aralfa has that cumin, basil, pine, green touches. You know, there's more going on. Kind of the way that they used to create fragrances in the 1980s, the late 80s, whenever they started to make aquatics like New West by Aramis. You know, it's not just an aquatic. There's a lot more going on. There's the oak moss in the base and all that stuff. And that's sort of how this feels, but more of a citrus spicy focus instead of aquatic, but it is leaning to the fresher side of things already. Good fragrance, but I really wish I could smell the OG. That's why this is at number 8 and no higher. Okay, number 7 is a very intriguing fragrance because it's a fragrance that is actually, the Osmotec credits Jean-Claude Ellena as the perfumer of note of this fragrance. And if you watched my Jean-Claude Ellena perfumers portfolio video that I did recently and I ranked it, I mentioned that Fragrantica shows him as the perfumer, but nowhere else does, actually. And the reason is that there are some contradictory sources, because some sources claim that Nicolas Malmounas was the creator of this, and this is Rochas Globe. And the reason that people, sources claim that Nicolas was actually the perfumer is that he created previous Rochas fragrances. So he did Eau de Rochas, he did Byzance, he did Macassar, Lumiere, and so yes, very, very, you know, he spent a lot of time with Rochas, let's say. But what's interesting about this is when you smell Rochas Globe, and this is a very underrated fragrance, by the way. I got two of these from fragrancebuy.ca or one of those, you know, discount sites where they sold both of these 15. So they sold me like 30 mils of juice for like $10. You know, it was like $5 each, $4.99. They're like, just take it, please. No one wants it. Which is sad because I think this is actually a really good perfume. And I'm going to do a full review on this because one thing that has popped up a little bit from some of my subscribers is, I love your channel. You talk about all these great fragrances, but I have no chance I'll ever smell them in my life. And one thing that I tell people is just always sort of look around. You might be surprised. So one thing that Rich Mitch sent me, he sent me an eBay link, and it was in the UK, so I couldn't have bought it anyways, nor was I looking. But if you were looking, there was actually a bottle of this. Now, this is a 50 mil, so it was 125 mil or 100 mil, one of the bigger bottles. I think it might have been 100 mil. And it sold for £1. So there's no reserve. It sold for £1 on eBay. And so that's the thing. On some of those sales where it's an auction style, you're not just going to see it listed at 100 or 200 bucks. It's auction. And so, you know, if you get lucky or no one's paying attention, there are deals to be had. That's how I bought my Calvin Klein. That's how I bought this. I bought this for 100 bucks. There was like one person bidding against me and they gave up. This was like, I don't remember, 3-4 years ago. So yes, I mean, I just tell people, keep an eye out, keep looking. You know, you never know what pops up and comes and goes, and sometimes you look and nothing's there, and sometimes you look and it's there. This is one of those fragrances where it's a vintage that I think only had one run. I don't think you have to worry about reformulation, and it's available. That's the thing. There are bottles floating around out there. You don't have to go break the bank to buy and own and experience this one. And that's a great way to build a collection. You're not just going to snap your fingers and have everything. You're going to have to slowly sort of build it up, right? So with Rochas Globe, the reason I say that Jean-Claude Ellena thing is so interesting to me is that if you look at the note listing on Rochas Globe, it's actually cumin, okay? And what's so fascinating about it is obviously Jean-Claude Ellena has a little bit of a, he's got an attachment with that cumin-y opening because of Eau de Hermes. But this is cumin in the top with some green aromatic touches. And if you've ever seen the advertisements for Rochas Globe, it's actually, there's one with like a man holding the bottle over the globe, but the globe is green. So that's Rochas' way, in my mind, when I smell this, it's Rochas' way of saying, you know, this is like a green planet, green globe type fragrance. The earth is green, right? And so there's a lot of this very convincing old school green notes in here, like balsam firs and artemisia and stuff like that. But you will get the spices. You'll also get some marigold, which marigold can, if you've ever smelled Boss Sport, there's a big hunk of marigold in here. Now, I love it, but it might put some people off because it has that dry, almost like wet straw feeling, wet hay. But what's so amazing about this is it dries down to a leather. Okay, so if you're, again, thinking Eau de Hermes in the back of your mind, and not that this smells anything like Eau de Hermes, but I know Jean-Claude Elena had a big affinity for Eau de Hermes, and it ended up being what influenced him to create Declaration, obviously. And, you know, this has that spicy opening that will remind you a bit of Eau de Hermes. But I'm just saying, I'm just mentioning that because of the fact that if you go with the premise of Jean-Claude Elena being the perfumer, you can definitely see his touches here. If you think about his teacher, Edmund Rudnitska, if you think about Jean-Claude Elena's new style, where he sort of came into his own as he became the in-house perfumer of Hermes, this won't smell anything like a Jean-Claude Elena creation. But this is 1990, so maybe he was still sort of trying to find his way, if you will. But an amazing sort of old school aromatic leathery fougere, if you will. If you like those leather style fougères, if you like something like this, actually, now that I'm just thinking about it, from the 80s, this is a fragrance that people ask me all the time. This is a very hard fragrance to find, Bally Masculine. But if you like stuff like this, definitely check out Rochas Globe. You might be pleasantly surprised, and this is cheap. I still think this is a much better fragrance, but Rochas Globe should be on your list. Okay, so that is number 7. Number 6 is actually a Trussardi fragrance, and it's a Trussardi that gets almost no love. This is one of those lost Trussardi fragrances to the past, and this is called Action Uomo. And if you take a look at that green packaging, so this is actually a 25 mil, it's actually a little 25 mil bottle that's you're supposed to be able to like throw it in your gym bag or something like that. But I actually really like the packaging, and I like the color because it actually, there's a couple fragrances that came out with this color in the late 80s into the early 90s. Another one that was very popular, or at least comes to mind, is Futuros by Abussin, the best fragrance Abussin's ever put out, by the way. But if you sort of look at this, and both of these fragrances share a similarity in that they both have this spicy, green, leather fougere thing going on. Very similar to the vibe of Rochas Globe. But what's different here is that the green notes really come at you from the beginning. There's not that cumin spice thing going on like in Rochas Globe in the opening. This is heavy green. You're going to get a lot of things like Artemisia, galbanum, which is a resin that is going to mix with peppermint. And so it does have a little bit of freshness to it because it has peppermint and neroli. And neroli usually adds that laundered, you know, almost orange blossom style freshness, clean sheet feeling. But it's just overwhelmed with green notes, lots of green notes. And when you take those green notes and you blend it with the lavender, this is sort of like the color I just imagine the juice going to. Not that it would, because many people assume lavender is purple. It's not. It's actually green. And so if you blend that lavender with all of these, you know, green notes, and then the mossiness in the base and this leather, this is sort of the color that pops into my mind. It's a great representation of the fragrance. And if you look, you'll see that that plastic looks very textured. The fragrance feels textured. And so this is one of those underrated fragrances. Actually, both of these, just since I'm mentioning them together. They obviously do different things, but they're both very underrated, and they both play in the same sandbox, if you will. So Trussardi Uomo. If you like fougères, that's what I'll say. If you're a fan of the classic fougères from the 80s, like if you like Gucci Nobile and that kind of thing, if that's your jam, but maybe you want it to be more intense, because even though this is a sport fragrance supposed to be action, they actually ended up coming out with Action Sport later on, I think a year or two later. If this wasn't referred to as a sport fragrance with that action in the name, I would never associate this with a sport fragrance, because this is thick and heavy and dense, and there's a little bit of freshness added. I think the lavender adds a little bit of this freshness to it, as does the peppermint. I think both of those and the neroli sort of freshen it up a bit. But all in all, this is a heavy green, spicy fragrance. So Trussardi's Action Uomo for men at number 6. Number 5. Number 5, we're actually going to go back to the great Italian book of perfumery, and it is Ocean Rain. So Ocean Rain, I've talked about on the channel a lot, periodically. I don't think I've done an individual video on Ocean Rain, but if you know anything about, if you know anything about fragrance history, this is the final fragrance that Edmund Rudnitska made. He was 84 years old when he made this fragrance, and I don't think he had made a fragrance for a decade or 15 years or something. It had been a long time. He came out of retirement. He came out of retirement to make this, and interestingly enough, you notice he didn't pick Dior, which he was famous for doing Dior fragrances. I'm sure they would have had him. He didn't pick any of the big, well-known houses. He picked Mario Valentino. He basically picked a house where they said, do whatever you want. We're not going to have any restrictions on you. You're a legend. You doing a fragrance for us is like, we owe you a thank you almost. So just do whatever you want. And so in this time, obviously 1990, he has a very interesting role to play in this saga, because he was a perfumer who, decades before any other perfumers were doing it, were playing with these cologne, aquatic, melony aldehydes. If you've ever smelled Le Parfum de Thérèse, okay? Le Parfum de Thérèse, which ended up being released as a Frederic Malle, he was playing with those notes in the 1960s. And he was so far ahead of all these other perfumers. And if you listen to Pierre Bourdon talk about it, he says, cologne sat on our shelves for decades. No one touched the stuff. No one liked it. No one knew how to use it. But Edmund Rudnitska was playing with those cologne notes, that melony aquatic vibe that you get from something like Diorella. If you've ever smelled Diorella, he sort of toned this down a little bit compared to what he was playing with things like Parfum de la Thérèse. Now, we ended up getting that released as a Frederic Malle in the year 2000, but he was playing with those type of ingredients decades before everyone else. So it's interesting to see him go back and revisit it now that everyone else is doing it or starting to do it. Him going back and revisiting a idea and material that he basically was the founder of. Not that he founded the materials, but he was the first one to sort of use them in any mass market way, let's say. And so the quote that the book basically says is, if Edmund, they call this a citrus chypre, by the way. If Edmund Rudnitska were still alive, how would he approach a contemporary men's fragrance with the ozonic notes of cologne, white musk, and the rest? Edmund Rudnitska has been the greatest master perfumer of them all. He composed masterpieces such as Femme and Moustache, Eau de Hermès, Diorella, Diorama, Diorissimo, Eau Sauvage, and many more. Rudnitska is the composer everyone respects, indeed reveres, for both his creative talent and human qualities. The answer to the question posed above is that Edmund Rudnitska, at the grand old age of 84, did author a modern men's fragrance, featuring all the characteristic notes of contemporary male perfumery, in Mario Valentino's Ocean Rain. The first spray lights up the air with the vigorous opening typical of Rudnitska's men's fragrances, lemon and bergamot, glazed with a whisper of hedione. Almost immediately joined by a classic fougere mix of lavender. See, it's interesting. Sometimes when people start getting into the categories, you'll notice that the classification here, so they say, and not that their word is, the almighty word of fragrance or anything like that, but they list citrus chypre as a classification. And then she goes in, or he or she, I don't know, Marika, I guess it's a woman who wrote this book, goes into saying that a classic fougere mix. And so don't think about the categories as these static, this is a chypre, this is a fougere. Sometimes they blend them together. There's nothing that says that there can't be blends of ideas as things become more and more the lines become more and more blurred, let's say. So mix of lavender, artemisia, thyme, and basil over which a floral bouquet of rose and cyclamen breathes a soft, humid, moving, subtly melancholic sensation. So cologne, in addition to the salty note, also adds a touch of sugar with a melon facet, and that melon facet you'll smell in things like Diorella, by the way. So if you're into, checking out different perfumers' work, you'll definitely see this similarity between the melon facets of his work. And if you go smell Pierre Bourdon's melon notes as well, you'll think back to Edmund Runitska's work as well. The lingering Chypre base accord features leathery nuances shaped by cedarwood, musk, frankincense, and amber. Its indefinable, opaque, chalky quality is as uncommon as it is interesting. Okay, so there's more that she writes, but you'll have to buy the book to read the rest. I will tell you that when I talk about this fragrance, what comes to me is this very antiseptic vibe. That's what comes to me. Like, if you've ever put hydrogen peroxide on a wound and it sort of bubbles up, imagine swimming in the ocean and you get this bubbly, when the water sort of hits the rocks and it forms this foam around the ocean. That's the feeling, almost like the oceans, many moons ago when life was just forming, right? That's sort of the feeling of this fragrance. It's very strange. It is very artistic, and most people will not like this. But as a fragrance connoisseur, somebody who wants to smell the unique and wants to understand how Edmund Runitska got from something like this to this is almost priceless, because this is a direct insight into the mind who trained Jean-Claude Elena and Pierre Bourdon and his son Michel Runitska. So, stuff like this is, like I say, it's almost priceless. Ocean Rain is one of the most interesting aquatics in my collection. I won't even call it a Citrus Chypre or a Fougere. This is just, to me, his take on a modern aquatic of the 90s, and it's so different from anything you could ever expect. So Ocean Rain comes in at number 5. Number 4. Number 4 is Lagerfeld's Photo. So I have a bottle from the Unilever division. So you can see this one is created by Unilever right there. I also have a mini of the vintage previous to this, which I forget who the distributor was, but the older version that everyone goes crazy over. So I'm going to do a comparison video one day. But I can tell you right off the bat that the reason that this is at number 4 is that this uses such a unique and distinct mixture of aldehydes in the top. Actually, the first time that I smelled this, the aldehydes were what grabbed me, because there's a lot of these very heavy notes in this fragrance. There's honey, there's galbanum, there's caraway, there's rose, old school carnation, jasmine, oak moss, cedar, amber, musk, sandalwood, benzoin, patchouli, tonka, gaiac wood, all of these very heavy notes. Somehow the perfumer made the aldehydic top in the opening one of the best aldehydic openings in men's perfumery. There's a lot of aldehydes used in women's perfumeries and chypres and stuff like that. But as a direct, marketed for men's perfumery, the aldehydic opening in this is really stunning. But you know what? Even though it has all those honey and heavy notes that I mentioned, I still prefer to wear this in the summer. There's just something, the muskiness sort of underneath. There's like this woody freshness that tends to come out. And if you've ever heard Chris from Scentland talk about this, I think there's a little bit of nostalgia there as well, because he wore this as a younger man. But I know he absolutely loves Photo, and I think that'll be a great comparison video to do. One of these days, I'm going to do that comparison video. Okay, next on the list. So that was number 4. Number 3. Number 3 and number 2, I went back and forth on over and over and over again. It was very hard for me to decide number 3 and number 2. I changed them, and then I changed them again, and then I changed them again. And the reason is, and I'll show you real quick what ended up being number 3. And once you see number 2, you'll know why. But this ended up losing out and getting the 3rd spot. It is Moschino Pour Homme. So this is discontinued. And Moschino Pour Homme, if you've ever seen the vintage bottle of this, go check out my brother Jonathan 1970s channel. He just did an unboxing where he unboxed a almost like a reversible. It's almost like I thought it was 2 atomizers, but it's not. One side of the bottle. So there's 2. It looks like there's one of these here on the bottom as well. And the reason is one side is a spray and the other side is a splash, which I've never seen that before. So the vintage old school bottles of this have this dual opening to the bottle. Insane. But the fragrance for Moschino Pour Homme is basically right back into the heart of the 80s. So imagine things like Bel Ami. Imagine things like Fendi Uomo, some of my all-time favorite leather fragrances from the 80s. And this is right there with that. Even though it came out in 1990, this is right there with that. It's rosemary, lavender, clary sage, bergamot, carnation, caraway, jasmine, orris root, rose, oak moss, leather, benzoin, cedar, castoreum, labdanum, styrax, tonka bean, and amber. And there's actually a little blurb on this in this Italian book of perfumery as well. And so here's what they say about Moschino Pour Homme. Where did you go? Aha, here you are. Okay, so Moschino Pour Homme, leather chypre. The first fragrance for men by Moschino has the exact amount of genius and unruliness you might expect from this extraordinary punk-inspired designer. Audacious to the point of being extreme, yet at the same time incredibly sophisticated, Moschino Pour Homme was incomprehensibly out of fashion at the time it was launched. So that's the thing is, and that's why I think this is such a brave release and why I really love it, is, you know, this fragrance really smells like it belongs in the 80s. Even though the 90s was starting in full swing, people were starting to put out their fresher fragrances. Moschino basically said, forget that. We're going to put out what we want to put out. And I give them big time props for that. Like they said, a very audacious release. And so it was, when it was launched, it was surrounded by clean, ozonic fragrances. And here this thing is like a, you know, like a remnant from the 80s. And it was actually composed following the personal taste of Franco Moschino. That's basically why they released it, because he had taste like I did, basically, who used it himself every day for years and years, making it his signature fragrance, I think until he passed away. 30 years later, many ozonic successes of the 90s may have been completely forgotten. While Moschino Pour Homme is still loved and sought after, it would surely make a fortune. It would surely make a fortune for any niche brand that made the effort to catch up its unusual, edgy character. Moschino Pour Homme bursts forth from the bottle with an aromatic fougere top. See, there it is again. She says it's a leather chypre, but she's saying it bursts forth with an aromatic fougere. I don't know if I necessarily like her style. And you know, one thing in writing, because one thing that I will say is, even though there's lavender in here, just because there's lavender doesn't mean it's a fougere. So I would say it bursts forth more with this oily rosemary and lavender spiciness and mace, soon to reach a spicy, moody floral pair with rose and carnation. While the opening of Moschino Pour Homme may seem that of a classic fougere of its time, its sensual ambery base takes just a few minutes to rise up, with resinous notes of labdanum and ambergris, vegetable musk, styrax officinalis. I don't know what styrax officinalis is versus regular styrax. Tonka bean, and a powerful leathery base. Definitely a powerful leathery base. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, there's something in this that feels very, the rosemary in the top feels very oily, and the styrax in the base feels waxy. So you can imagine going from something that's sort of this oily top to this waxy bottom and this big spicy leather in between. Very interesting. Very, as they say statuesque sophistication, like Bellamy, the original Aramis, Yatagan, Keniche 10. Those are some of the fragrances that they mentioned. But its regal position, I've never read any of these, and I've not read this book in full, so I'm sort of reading this for the first time as well. Regal position is right in the front row alongside its more vibrant, complex forebearers. Okay, so she has a very interesting writing style. Maybe I won't read live from her books on these videos anymore, but needless to say, this almost gave number 2 a run for its money, but in the end, it ended up going to 3, and the reason being because, you know, whenever I want to reach for one of those fragrances, the problem this fragrance has to me, my mind, whenever I want to reach for one of those fragrances, I will usually just grab for Bellamy or even Fendi Uomo or Trussardi Uomo or some of the true 80s leather powerhouses. Do I mind wearing this? No, but what pops in my mind every time I wear it is, God, I wish I was just wearing Bellamy. And that's the problem Moschino Pour Homme has, is it's a great fragrance, and I see exactly why it was discontinued, because like the book said, even when it was issued, even when it was released at its time, it was basically out of fashion. But for someone like me who likes the leather chypres, this is great to have in the collection, but it just couldn't go any higher than number 3, although it was damn close, because I love this style. I love this style. I just, you know, many times I'm like, man, I wish I just would have worn my baby Bellamy whenever I wear Moschino Pour Homme. So that leaves 2 and number 1. So number 2, number 1 was No Doubt. So that leaves this at number 2, and that is Egoiste. So Egoiste, so I've got multiple bottles of Egoiste. This one came from Enchanté. This is a vintage of Egoiste, and this is the original L'Egoiste, which I think they maybe released this in, you know, different parts of the world when it first came out as the Egoiste, and then everything just became standardized as Egoiste. So these older L'Egoiste bottles are, this is probably my favorite bottle of just regular Egoiste that I have in my collection. I also have a newer bottle with the black atomizer instead of the silver atomizer. And I can tell you that this is still a great fragrance, even in its current form. You can see the juice isn't as dark. It's a little bit lighter, but this is still, Chanel takes good care of their fragrances. All fragrance houses that have an in-house perfumer, I feel like, do that. And Egoiste is a spicy, woody fragrance, but what's interesting is it flopped when it came out. So in 1990, Chanel spent something like $50 million. That was according to one of the Ghost Perfumer book. They talked a little bit about how much money Chanel spent on advertising for Egoiste. And if you've ever seen those Egoiste ads, they're fantastic. The women open the shutters in the streets of Italy, yelling "Egoiste, Egoiste" as the guys sort of walking by. It just didn't sell as well as they had hoped. It was sort of a commercial flop. But one of the advantages to frag heads is that we now have just a fantastic fragrance. It originally was Bois Noir. I would love a bottle of Bois Noir, but they're just so hard to find. But this is coriander, mandarin orange, rosewood, mahogany, cinnamon, carnation, rose, sandalwood, tobacco, vanilla, amber, and leather. And this is known as one of the best sandalwood fragrances in the designer realm of all time. And I do think the sandalwood in the base is fantastic, but this is so much more, is the thing. This is, I love the rosewood in the top. I love the tobacco in the base. I love that cinnamony, ambery, oriental, leathery feel. So even though, yes, this is one of the best sandalwood designers ever released, I think, this is so much more than that. There's so much more going on between the spices, the woods, the ambers, the leathery bit in the dry down, the tobacco, the vanilla. It's just fantastic. Oh, it's a brilliant fragrance for a frag head. And you know what? This is one of those things where most people wear this in winter. If you ever wear this in the heat, it really shines. Don't overlook Egoiste in the heat. Usually if I'm going to wear it in the heat, I'll wear the newer one. But in the heat, I think it really does shine. Okay, next on the list is number 1. So that only leaves one. And you guys know what it is. If you know 1990, you know there's absolutely no doubt what number 1 is. This is Balenciaga Parfum. So Balenciaga Parfum is created by the great Gerard Anthony. And Gerard Anthony, interestingly enough, this was a flop as well. But this is one of my favorite fragrances of all time. I think in my top 100 that I did, if I'm not mistaken, this was like top 10 or top 15, somewhere around there. But not the niche one, the top 100 that I did when I hit 1,000 subscribers. This is up there in my all-time favorites. And I think this is a take on a fougere. Whereas, you know, some of the other things some folks will call fougères, I don't always agree with. I think this is a take on a fougere. Even though it has this, the way that the honey sort of blends with the patchouli in this, out of this world good. But I do think this is a fougere construction just because of the way that the lavender, there's some sandalwood and patchouli in the base and benzoin and vanilla. But the honeyed patchouli aspect of this, there's this heft to it. If you've ever heard Thomas from Early Greek describe this, he describes it as obsidian. And, you know, if you take a look at that top, and it just looks like a stone that no light can see through. There's this, you know, how would you say? There's just this heft to it. You know, there's this, it's almost like you are thinking you're going to pick up a 5-pound dumbbell, and it's actually like 100 pounds shrunk, like a you know, black hole into just a small space, and you try to pick it up and it just weighs your hand down. There's this heft to this fragrance, but because it has that lavender fougere style, there's also this uplifting bit to it. But I love Balenciaga Parfum, and the cinnamon in this, my God. I mean, this and I've said this before, but there is something to me with early 90s releases, and the way that they did the cinnamon note back then was just so unique. You know, very, for some reason, I don't know what it was, but if you've smelled things like, for example, if you smelled this, the cinnamon that they used in this is an Alberto Mordias creation. This is Romeo Gigli per Uomo. This is fantastic. I love the way the cinnamon is used here, and here as well. The cinnamon plays a major role here. Also, there's a lot of people that ask me, is there any replacement for Balenciaga Parfum? I just can't find one. And the answer to that is no. There is no replacement, unfortunately, to Balenciaga Parfum. If you want Balenciaga Parfum, you just got to get the OG. You got to find a way. Get a smaller bottle. This is a 30 ml. They're still floating around out there from time to time. Get with the Nuge. Maybe he can find a bottle for you from Enchante. But if you can't find Balenciaga Parfum and you want sort of something that after a couple hours, not the opening, but after 2 to 3 hours starts to go down the Balenciaga Parfum path, try to find a bottle of Abussin Homme. These were selling on eBay for like 10, 15 bucks. No one wanted them. This is discontinued now, so I don't know if it's still selling for $10 or $15, but I scooped this up for a very cheap price, and Abussin Homme has a little bit, and it's interesting. Look, they also put this strange material on top. Not exactly the same, but same idea, if you will. And there's almost this clay material here. And so this doesn't feel exactly like Balenciaga Parfum. And when you first spray, you're going to think Ramsey's lost his mind. There's no Balenciaga Parfum DNA, but let it dry down. As the hours start to tick by, you'll notice a similar construction underneath. And this came out a couple years after Balenciaga Parfum, so I think there is some, let's say, some borrowing of ideas here. But yes, Balenciaga Parfum to me, also rumored to have the very first oud note, if you will, in Western perfumery. There's definitely a heft to this fragrance, and it has to be my number 1. No question asked. This went to number 1 when I made the list. This started at number 1, and nothing could dethrone it. The biggest back and forth was probably 2 and 3. because I could easily see Moschino pour Homme, you know, jumping to that second spot. But in the end, Egoiste is just so unique. There's nothing like Egoiste out there to me, except for GOF Trumper tried to copy Egoiste. You know, a decade or two later, I forget exactly when this came out, but they created Sandalwood Cologne, which smells very much like Egoiste. It just smells like Egoiste. I mean, I don't know how they did it, but it really does smell like Egoiste. And so for me, I'd probably just wear Egoiste. I think it's better, but this is still a good fragrance. But outside of this, there's just very little like Egoiste. And so I feel like it deserved that second spot. So let me know what your favorites are from the top 9. I know we covered a lot of stuff today. We read from a book, which I don't think I like. Going in hindsight, just doesn't flow with my style as well. But the book is still sort of a cool little reference. And I think I got this for like $10. So this is the kind of stuff you can keep your eye out as well if you want to learn more about some of the different perfume styles. So let me know what your favorites are. I'll be doing some more individual reviews soon, which should be great. So thanks everyone for watching. Appreciate the support as always. Cheers, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.